Welcome to VSOW. We're embarking today on, well, a really rigorous deep dive into one of the most critical, complex, and let's face it, distinctively American subjects, the nation's pervasive gun culture.
Yeah, and our analysis today, it aims to go beyond maybe the familiar debates over policy and legislation that you hear all the time. We're really delving into a pretty substantial body of sources, sociological, psychological, historical, trying to understand how the firearm has fundamentally transformed, from just a utility, a tool,
Right.
into this incredibly powerful symbol. And this transformation involves what academics are calling firearms fetishism. It anchors identity, moral self-understanding, power. Especially in a socio-political climate, you see really exemplified in a state like Texas.
And the need for this deep dive, I think, is just underscored by data that shows this, well, frankly, shocking divergence between the U.S. and pretty much every other comparable developed nation. We really have to start there, I think, with the reality of what this culture actually produces.
Indeed. When you synthesize the international health and safety statistics, the American experience with firearms, it's an anomaly. The sources we looked at confirm that people in the United States are 10 times more likely to be killed by guns than the collective population of all other developed countries combined. That's not a small statistical blip, it's a massive gap in public safety.
And if we break that down, looking at specific types of gun deaths, the figures get even starker, don't they?
They really do. The U.S. gun-related murder rate, it's 25 times higher than in any other high-income nation. 25 times. And just as tragically, the gun-related suicide rate is 8 times higher. These are, they're public health crises unfolding against this backdrop of just immense weapon proliferation.
Which brings us to the sheer volume.
Exactly. The sheer volume is driving this crisis. The United States civilian population collectively owns half of all the guns in the entire world. So this massive saturation rate means gun violence is quite rightly designated by researchers as a true public health epidemic and a social tragedy really unique to this nation.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When you're faced with these numbers, this pervasive, really unique crisis, the question just jumps out. Why? Why is this happening only in America? Why, in a nation that leads the world in so many other fields, is this one lethal phenomenon just so far beyond comparison? The sources seem to suggest the answer lies in the conceptual role the gun now occupies in the national psyche, which leads us straight to this theoretical framework of fetishism.
That really is the essential insight here. To understand the cultural investment in firearms, we have to rigorously define this concept of fetishism. Now, while the popular usage immediately conjures, sexual connotation.
Like what most people think of.
Exactly. But in academic theory, sociology, anthropology, psychoanalysis, the term actually denotes a much broader displacement of meaning.
Okay, so can you maybe articulate the more complex definition we're working with for this deep dive?
Certainly. In this context, a fetish is, it's a complex locus of power. It's an assemblage of beliefs and desires that gains this extraordinary value by displacing its primary meaning. It transcends its material function to become a source of reverence, fascination, or, critically, even worship. The gun is sort of imbued with a meaning that is socially constructed, and we can analyze this through 3 powerful academic interpretations we found in the source material.
Okay, let's delve into those 3 lenses then, starting with the earliest definition.
Right, the first one is the religious power object. This interpretation, it dates way back to early anthropological thought, specifically Charles de Bross's in 1760. In this view, certain objects are believed to possess extraordinary, sometimes almost magical or sacred significance. These objects act as conduits, bridging the gap between the sacred and the profane. They possess both supernatural power, like a protective or moral force, and real, tangible power.
So the gun gets treated, symbolically anyway, as an artifact with almost spiritual agency. It's tangible, yeah, but it carries this extraordinary, unseen force.
Precisely. It might be revered, polished, displayed in a way that suggests it's much more than just, molded metal and wood. And this leads directly into our second lens, the commodity fetishism model.
Ah, okay. This one's rooted in Marxist theory. How does Marx's understanding of commodities apply to, say, the modern firearm?
Well, Marx argued that in capitalism, commodities gain this fetishized value. Their exchange value, what they signify socially, it kind of replaces their use value, what they actually do. The physical object ends up hiding the true significance of the human labor and the social relations that were required to produce it. And instead, powers or meanings that the object doesn't inherently possess are sort of invested in it by the market and, importantly, by the consumer.
So the gun's value isn't just that it fires bullets,
Right.
but it's the idea of freedom or power or readiness that it represents in this, like, marketplace of identity and consumption.
That's exactly where the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard's refinement becomes really crucial. Baudrillard emphasized the social value gained through an exchange of signs. Advertising, media, rhetoric, they all work systematically to kind of empty the commodity of its real history or its lethal social relations and then fill it back up with imaginary meaning. So when a person buys, say, a specific brand of assault rifle, they aren't just acquiring a tool, they're purchasing a signifier, a visible signal of their ideological loyalty, their political identity, their commitment to a certain way of life. The gun acts as a kind of substitute for complex social satisfaction.
And the third lens, the psychoanalytic one. This is maybe the most recognizable to the layperson, but the academic meaning, especially through someone like Lacan, is often misunderstood, right?
Indeed. Starting with Freud, yes, the fetish often represents a phallic substitute, a compensation for a perceived lack. However, Lacan moved beyond just the physical substitution. He defined the fetish as more of a symbolic marker, an imaginary entity that fills a subjective void.
Can we break that down a bit? What did Lacan mean by filling a lack or a void in this context? Is it kind of like, I don't know, someone buying a really high-end car to feel complete or successful?
That's actually an excellent analogy. The gun becomes the psychological anchor for transforming deep-seated anxiety, maybe anxiety over economic instability or changing social norms, or even just personal insecurity into something one feels they can control and believe in. It enables this desire to become an ideal person, powerful, protected, fully self-actualized. It compensates for a feeling of perhaps emasculation or social irrelevance. The gun, as a symbol, provides this illusory sense of completeness that the individual feels is missing in their real social life.
Wow. Okay, so when we look at the cultural landscape of gun ownership, especially somewhere like Texas, we really see these three lenses, the sacred object, the commodity sign, and the psychological compensator kind of converging, don't they, into this single cultural phenomenon.
The convergence is just perfectly illustrated by one source's analysis of a roadside gun shop sign they found in Madisonville, Texas. The sign simply read, "God, Guns, and Sons."
That's quite a juxtaposition.
It is. That sign, it simultaneously connects the religious imperative, God, the commodity and power object, guns, and the maintenance of traditional masculine identity, sons. This convergence really demonstrates that the fetishism allows the firearm to operate across all these spheres. Socially, it secures collective recognition as a protector. It upholds a moral vision. Individually, it anchors the owner's moral self-understanding and their sense of belonging. The gun, therefore, becomes this signifier standing for something incredibly complex, a cultural representation of a powerful, virtuous kind of Americanness.
In this symbolic role, it represents a major historical evolution in gun use, which takes us from what the sources are calling gun culture 1.0 to gun culture 2.0.
Yeah, this cultural shift is palpable. You can actually measure directly by analyzing the objectives and the rhetoric of the NRA and also the corresponding marketing trends over time.
So gun culture 1.0, basically the pre-1977 model,
Yeah.
that was focused overwhelmingly on utility, right? Hunting, traditional sport, marksmanship, recreational shooting. That was the traditional core of the NRA.
That's right. But this culture, centered on rural life and the sportsman ethic, it's statistically in decline.
A pretty significant decline.
Oh, yeah, very significant. The percentage of households containing adult hunters dropped by almost half between 1977 and 2018. The monumental shift that really redefined American gun culture happened in 1977. It's known as the Revolt in Cincinnati. Before this event, the NRA was primarily a recreational organization focused on gun safety and sport.
But that revolt was basically an internal coup by a more hardline faction.
It was a successful internal takeover, absolutely.
Yeah.
The new leadership, led by figures like Harlan Carter, they pivoted radically. Gun Culture 2.0 pretty much abandoned the primary focus on sport and redirected the NRA's massive resources toward enshrining the Second Amendment as an absolute individual right centered almost entirely on self-defense and anti-government individualism.
And the statistics reflecting the transformation and motivation for ownership are just staggering.
They really reveal the scale of the change. Look at this. In 1999, hunting was the primary stated motivation for gun ownership, cited by 49% of owners. Protection was a distant second at 26%. Okay, fast forward to 2013. the numbers had flipped entirely. Protection became the #1 reason, cited by 48% of owners, while hunting dropped down to 32%. This signifies the complete transition of the gun from being, an object of leisure and utility to being a totem of perceived necessity in a world defined by insecurity and threat.
And this culture, it starts young. It establishes the gun as this critical cultural artifact, often framed specifically as a rite of passage, especially for men.
It's fundamentally integrated into the cultural fabric, particularly in rural and southern contexts. The sources really highlight the ritualistic importance of getting that first gun. We see this in the anecdote of the man who received his 20-gauge shotgun as a reward for his Catholic confirmation.
Oh.
And he explicitly called it the bar mitzvah of the rural West. This merging of religion, coming of age, and acquiring lethal power, it reinforces a very specific type of kind of frontier masculinity.
And the data on early exposure, it really reinforces this gendered component too, confirming the gun's role within sort of the male domain.
Absolutely. The Pew data shows a significant divide there. Of men who grew up in gun-owning households, 70% were taken hunting. Compare that to only 39% of women. Similarly, 73% of men had visited a shooting range versus just 51% of women. The socialization around firearms is disproportionately aimed at making boys feel comfortable with lethal weapons, seeing them as a natural component of their identity and their future responsibilities.
Now, the culture emphasizes safety and responsibility, of course, but the sources also point to a critical paradox here. This very normalization of lethal weaponry among children carries immense risk.
Yeah, the normalization risk is profound. While organizations like the NRA offer safety programs like Eddie Eagle, which uses coloring pages and workbooks to teach kids, stop, don't touch, run away, tell a grown-up.
Right, I've heard of that.
The material presence of lethal weapons in the home just fundamentally raises the stakes. One source noted that in a single recent year, there were more than 50 incidents involving children unintentionally harming themselves or others with unsecured firearms. The culture frames the gun as this moral object, but its physical reality remains inherently dangerous, especially to the impressionable. That gap between the fetishized, safe, moral symbol and the deadly reality, it's a constant contradiction.
This cultural embedding, particularly around masculinity and moral duty, it leads us directly into the ideological fusion, how the gun became this religious and political symbol.
Well, since that shift in 1977, the NRA has, frankly, brilliantly employed religious language to basically sacralize the Second Amendment. Gun ownership was rebranded as a God-given right. This elevates the debate beyond just mere legal statute into one of moral necessity, and opposing gun control became framed as engaging in a kind of holy war.
And their choice of spokesperson, that perfectly channeled that religio-cultural message, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Charlton Heston, who famously portrayed Moses in the Ten Commandments, he was leveraged as the public face of the NRA. His persona carried the specific religio-cultural cachet, giving the impression that he was a figure capable of handing down God's law, not just, political ideology. In fact, the former CEO of the organization, Warren Cassidy, openly stated, and this is a quote, "You would get a far better understanding if you approached us as if you were approaching one of the great religions of the world."
Wow, that quote that's the ultimate confirmation of the gun as a religious power object right there.
It really is. And this ideology connects the belief in gun rights to wider movements like Christian nationalism and the specific doctrine of dominion theology, which suggests, that the U.S. should be governed by Christian principles. When the firearm is situated within this kind of holy nexus, it transitions from being a simple instrument to the sanctioned fetish object required to defend divine will and American virtue. It creates this rigid moral binary that intertwines the First Amendment right to worship and the Second Amendment right to carry.
And the ultimate expression of this fusion is that narrative so central to Gun Culture 2.0, the good guy with a gun, or GGWAG.
Yes, this narrative, really crystallized by the NRA after the Newtown shooting, states unequivocally, "The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun." This statement fulfills that psychological desire we identified earlier. The gun becomes the hero maker, transforming the anxious, potentially emasculated male into the virtuous citizen protector.
And we have those two key Texas anecdotes that didn't just reinforce this imaginary, but actually helped cement it into state law.
Right. The first and highly influential one was the 2017 Sutherland Springs tragedy. Stephen Williford, a local resident, armed himself with an AR-15 and confronted the shooter. Williford, running out barefoot, determined. He was instantly elevated by the media and the political sphere as this national hero, the embodiment of the GGWAG.
And the symbolic power was literally marked onto his new weapon, wasn't it?
Precisely. A manufacturer gifted him a replacement AR-15, and it was engraved with a specific biblical citation, Romans 13.4, which reads, "For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." Wilford publicly framed his actions not just as simple self-defense, but as a moral battle between good and evil, stating that God had shaped him for that specific day. This is the religious power object in action, clear as day.
And the second anecdote, the West Freeway church shooting in 2019, that provided the necessary legal validation for some pretty controversial legislation.
Yeah, when Jack Wilson, a security volunteer, took down that shooter in under 6 seconds, the incident immediately became the definitive case study used by proponents of Senate Bill 535. The quick resolution seemingly validated the new law's premise almost as soon as it passed.
Okay, tell us more about SB 535 and its context in Texas law.
Right, so SB 535, passed in 2019, it fundamentally altered the legal geography of Texas. It removed places of worship churches, synagogues, mosques from the list of explicitly excluded places where licensed individuals were forbidden to carry firearms. Now, opponents had argued this increased the risk of accidental shootings, confrontations in sacred spaces,
Yeah.
but the legislative debate was successfully framed in terms of defeating evil intentions. Proponents argued, and this is a quote from the debates, "We have learned many times over that there is no such thing as a gun-free zone. Those with evil intentions will violate the law and carry out their heinous acts no matter what." So this successfully erased that separation of the secular and the sacred when it came to carrying a lethal weapon in Texas.
Now, beyond religion, this hero narrative also taps into older, deeply entrenched sociological drivers, including regional identity and this cultural concept of honor.
Yes, we really have to look at the Southern culture of violence and the associated culture of honor. Historically, in areas where maybe centralized law enforcement was sparse or seen as inadequate, individuals felt compelled to establish and defend their personal reputation, their property, their honor. This established a norm where any insult or affront required a swift, sometimes even lethal retaliation to maintain social standing. It's a culture rooted in that eye for an eye concept, often traced back to historical herding communities.
And how does this specifically shape the perception of masculinity in the South?
Well, Southern masculinity is often defined by a readiness to act upon, let's say, primal instincts. Aggression, dominance, a protective posture. These are often seen as hallmarks of the true Southern male. The gun serves as the perfect masculine surrogate here. In periods of socioeconomic decline, or maybe due to shifting gender roles that challenge traditional male dominance, the firearm, with its obvious phallic significance that Freud identified, it kind of compensates for a perceived decline in male virility or societal emasculation. Owning the gun becomes a reassertion of relevance, transforming the man into the necessary citizen protector. So to lose the firearm in this frame is potentially to lose one's symbolic male power.
This whole cultural and ideological fusion is really enabled by a powerful political and legal structure. Let's look now at the federal policy roadblocks that have simultaneously insulated the gun industry and, well, stifled public health research on the topic.
Okay, yeah. The key structural mechanism that really obstructed scientific understanding for decades is the Dickey Amendment, passed back in 1996. This was a direct result of intense lobbying by the NRA.
What exactly did this budget rider do to research? It sounds kind of innocuous, but it had a big impact.
It did. The amendment was inserted into the federal spending bill, and it stipulated that none of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC funds, could be used to advocate or promote gun control. Now, technically, it didn't explicitly forbid research, but the accompanying language slashed the CDC's injury prevention funding by the exact amount that had previously been used for firearm research. This effectively sent a chilling message to researchers. Engage in gun violence research at your peril. The result was a decades-long freeze on federally funded research into gun violence, even though it's clearly a public health epidemic.
So it essentially removed gun violence from the realm of scientific study, treating it differently than, say, car safety or infectious diseases.
Precisely. It ensured that public policy debates would rely more on ideological claims rather than robust scientific data. And the amendment was a direct response to studies in the 1990s, like the 1993 Kellerman study, which had found a statistically significant increase in the risk of homicide when a firearm was present in the home. The NRA vehemently opposed those findings and successfully argued to Congress that the research was biased towards promoting gun control.
Okay. Moving beyond public health, the legal foundation for gun rights itself was dramatically reinforced by the Supreme Court in 2008.
Yes, The D.C. v. Heller decision was absolutely monumental. Justice Scalia's majority ruling fundamentally reinterpreted the Second Amendment. Historically, many argued the phrase, a well-regulated militia, meant the right was a collective one, tied to state security. Heller shifted this interpretation to guarantee an individual right to keep and bear arms, specifically for self-protection within the home initially. This individualistic reading rendered the well-regulated militia clause functionally, well, almost obsolete in contemporary jurisprudence. It made any attempts at regulation significantly more challenging legally.
And finally, on the federal level, there's the ultimate protection for the manufacturers themselves.
Right. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLCAA, from 2005. This is a really powerful and quite unique piece of legislation. It grants gun manufacturers, distributors, and dealers broad immunity from being sued for harm caused by the criminal misuse of their products.
So just to be clear, this means if a gun is legally sold and then later used in, say, a mass shooting, the victims generally cannot sue the company that manufactured or sold that weapon.
Exactly. Provided the product functioned as designed and the sale was legal, the industry is shielded. This stands in really sharp contrast to virtually every other industry, from automobiles to pharmaceuticals, where civil liability serves as a critical mechanism for ensuring product safety and responsible marketing. PLCAA effectively protects the industry from bearing the financial consequences of the social costs associated with their products.
Okay, let's turn now to the state level, specifically Texas again. We see these federal protections kind of mirrored and even amplified by local legal mechanisms, starting with how licenses are actually issued.
Yes, Texas operates as a shall-issue state, which is quite distinct from may-issue states. And this distinction is critical to understanding the proliferation of guns.
What's the core difference there between shall issue and may issue?
Okay, so in a may-issue state, the issuing authority, often the police or a local sheriff, has discretion. They can deny a license to carry, LTC, if the applicant fails to show good cause or if there are maybe concerns about their character or stability. In a shall-issue state like Texas, authorities must issue the LTC if the applicant meets the bare minimum statutory requirements. Things like being 21, having 4 to 6 hours of training, submitting fingerprints, and not being a felon or declared legally unsound of mind. The key thing that's lost is that essential discretion based on perceived public safety risk.
And the data seems to confirm that removing that discretion has measurable negative outcomes.
Yeah, studies tracking the implementation of these laws show pretty clear negative consequences. States that adopted shall-issue laws experienced, on average, 6.5% higher total homicide rates, 8.6% higher firearm homicide rates, and even 10.6% higher handgun homicide rates compared to if they hadn't. The process in Texas is really designed to be swift and relatively frictionless, a few hours of training, a minimal fee, and often a pretty rapid turnaround time for the license.
And that speed and ease of acquisition is then leveraged by this highly problematic loophole known as concealed carry reciprocity, or CCR.
Ah, yes, CCR. It fundamentally undermines even the minimal requirements of Texas law. It basically forces Texas to recognize licenses to carry obtained in other states, even those states with dramatically laxer standards.
So if someone can't actually meet Texas's requirements, they could potentially legally circumvent them by getting a license somewhere else.
Precisely. Consider a state like, say, South Dakota, which at times has required only a $10 fee, no fingerprint, and no in-person training at all. That license is fully valid in Texas under CCR. This means individuals who might be ineligible for a Texas LTC, perhaps due to outstanding warrants, certain types of misdemeanors, or even outstanding child support debts, which is a specific disqualifier in Texas, they can obtain a paper license from a more permissive state and carry legally in Texas. It completely negates the purpose of having Texas-specific requirements. Law enforcement officials have openly criticized this, saying it forces them to make impossible split-second decisions about the validity of permits with vastly different requirements, potentially endangering both the public and themselves.
But all of this really leads to the current legislative push we see for constitutional carry in Texas and other states.
Right. Constitutional carry is kind of the ultimate expression of the individual rights perspective. It's the movement to allow the carrying of firearms, either openly or concealed, with absolutely no permit, no training, no fee whatsoever. Proponents argue vehemently that requiring any permit, even one costing a small amount, turns a fundamental constitutional right into an expensive privilege. You often hear the phrase, "A right delayed is a right denied."
So this perspective views pretty much any regulation, however minor it might seem, as an unjust economic burden that violates the sanctity of the Second Amendment.
It connects directly back to the fetishism we discussed. If the gun represents ultimate moral virtue and freedom, then any restriction on its immediate acquisition or carrying is perceived not just as a practical measure, but as an ideological attack on that very identity and moral virtue.
Okay, before we move fully into the moral identity construction, we really should address the complex and often quite contradictory gendered marketing of firearms.
Yes, the marketing targeted at women presents a fascinating paradox, especially given the deeply masculine foundation of gun culture 2.0 we talked about. While women do cite protection as their primary reason for carrying, with almost 27% citing it as the only reason, which is much higher than men, the marketing often leans into and reinforces gender stereotypes.
Yeah, we frequently see the use of pretty explicit fear tactics targeting women, specifically referencing sexual assault and a perceived vulnerability.
Exactly. The rhetoric often suggests women are inherently fragile and therefore require the technological equalizer of the firearm to defend themselves. This is then often paired with specifically gendered products. Pink pistols, glitzy finishes, sexy or unassuming holsters designed to look like accessories. Products designed to make the weapon feel less like a lethal tool and more like, well, an accessory.
And this contrasts pretty sharply with the male market, where the gun is often positioned as more of a fun, manly accessory or a sporting tool, or even a family heirloom, somewhat detached from that immediate fear of victimization.
The contrast is quite clear. For women, the marketing often frames the gun as a necessity born out of fear. For men, it's more often marketed as a virtue and a fun accessory that enhances social standing. However, the core identity integration remains similar. Approximately half of both male and female gun owners state that gun ownership is critical to their overall identity.
And this intense identity fusion brings us to that highly charged and polarizing term used sometimes to describe this strong affection, the amosexual.
Amosexual, yeah. It's a highly effective term rhetorically because it deliberately invokes that sexual connotation of the fetish, aiming to criticize what's seen as an obsession. While critics definitely use it as a slur to imply an unhealthy fixation, some gun advocates have actually attempted to reclaim the term.
How do advocates define it when they try to reclaim it?
Well, they tend to define it as a profound but explicitly non-sexual attraction to the firearm's design, its engineering, its history, the sense of security it provides, or even just the simple tactile sensation of handling it. It's framed as an attraction to the symbolic object of freedom itself. However, the critics' definitions, which you find in popular sources like Urban Dictionary, are much more visceral and, frankly, pointed.
Those definitions often highlight a link between power, violence, and maybe even pleasure.
They often do. One definition specifically invoked the phallic substitution idea, describing the pleasure gained from the ritual of loading and firing, directly linking the power to kill with a sense of, well, libidinal satisfaction. Another definition describes the amosexual as someone often contemplating, quote, shooting others legally, often in self-defense as to get away with it scot-free. The term really captures the polarization and the perception, at least from critics, that the intense attachment borders on an obsession that blurs the lines between civic responsibility and personal gratification.
And this overt sexual political commentary was famously leveraged in that Texas student protest, Cocks Not Glocks.
Yes, the 2016 UT Austin protest against the campus carry law. That was a brilliant piece of semiotic activism. Students used the juxtaposition of sex and violence to highlight what they saw as the absurdity and hypocrisy of the law. They openly carried large dildos, which, under Texas state law at the time, were actually illegal to carry openly in public, to protest the legality of openly carrying a lethal firearm on campus.
So it was a very clear, very pointed visual argument they were making.
Absolutely. And the slogans they used, things like the larger the Glocks, the smaller the cocks, directly targeted that psychoanalytic understanding of the gun as a potential phallic substitute. They were publicly mocking the perceived idea that gun ownership compensates for a lack of virility or masculine power. It powerfully underscored that the gun, as a symbol, carries immense and often quite contradictory cultural weight.
Okay, let's circle back now to the core psychological mechanism that seems necessary for the good guy to own this lethal fetish object while still maintaining a virtuous moral identity.
Right. This appears to require significant mental detachment, what some researchers refer to as, well, mental gymnastics. Researchers have found that gun owners often successfully detach themselves from the gun's inherent lethal purpose by consistently redefining it as just a benign tool. Much like a car or a hammer or even a ballpoint pen.
So by calling it simply a tool, they effectively remove the lethal potential from the object itself and place all moral responsibility entirely on the person operating it. Guns don't kill people.
People kill people.
Yeah.
Exactly. This normalization process allows them to redefine the potential act of taking a human life. Killing, in this specific context, gets reconceptualized not as murder, but as a morally necessary action, the ultimate saving of a life. And this is achieved by maintaining an extremely rigid, very simplified binary between the good guy, the virtuous moral arm protector, and the bad guy, the utterly immoral, inherently violent target.
And the legal landscape, particularly in states like Texas, structurally validates this moral identity construction.
That validation comes significantly through stand your ground laws, including Texas's specific version, often called the Castle Doctrine. These laws grant legal immunity to individuals who shoot in response to a perceived threat, allowing them to walk free, provided they weren't engaged in unlawful activity themselves. This legally sanctions the use of deadly force for self-protection, even in public spaces, which fundamentally validates that good guy with a gun hero imaginary. The gun owner's moral self-understanding that they are the necessary force for good is constantly reinforced by both law and the surrounding culture.
Okay. We have covered a lot of ground here: the alarming data, the three academic definitions of firearms, fetishism, religious, commodity, psychoanalytic, a big cultural shift from utility to identity, the political machinery shielding the industry, and the moral identity required to wield this fetish object. What's the essential synthesis we should maybe take away from all this?
I think the synthesis is that modern U.S. gun culture is just inseparable from this concept of firearms fetishism. The gun is profoundly saturated in layers upon layers of symbolic meaning. It acts as a sacred totem, a commodity that promises power and identity, and a symbolic anchor for individual, particularly masculine identity. This is really crystallized in states like Texas, as we've seen. The inherent danger in this framework, though, is the profound polarization it generates.
Right, because when the act of buying and carrying a gun becomes ideologically linked to being a good American and upholding moral virtue, it creates this extreme moral and political divide that's very hard to bridge.
Exactly. That ideological gulf, often expressed through othering and heated political rhetoric, risks creating what some of the sources refer to as two Americas. Polarization gets exacerbated when the individualist strain the focus on the sanctity of one's own rights and possessions is perceived as fundamentally more important than the safety of the collective. The ideological power of the gun makes even sensible regulation seem like an existential threat to identity itself.
So if we end with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, building on this idea of fetishism and maybe Baudrillard's loss of the real, what's the ultimate consequence we really need to consider?
Well, we return to Baudrillard's idea that when the signifier, that gun imaginary of freedom, virtue, protection, gains dominance over reality, the actual moral order might be threatened. So the core question perhaps is this: if a gun owner's identity is fundamentally built upon the gun's symbolic power and its moral context, does challenging the availability or the unrestricted use of that gun risk threatening the entire social moral order they have constructed around it? And maybe even more pointedly, when political rhetoric constantly fans the flames of fear, suggesting that the government is poised to seize these anchors of identity, what happens when that manufactured imaginary starts to lead towards a kind of self-fulfilling, maybe even apocalyptic prophecy?
A deeply complex question to consider as you digest all this material. If this deep dive sparked further questions for you, or maybe areas you want to explore more, we definitely encourage you to subscribe, like, and comment wherever you're listening.
Yeah, thank you for joining us as we unpacked this really complex and sensitive topic today.
And thank you for listening to VSOW.